Now I'm going to welcome Dr. Richard on the screen. Dr. Richard has been a lecturer at the University of Pretoria for years, and he has worked in the zoo and also in private practice with wildlife. So he's going to do a short presentations on the giraffe diseases. So right now, let me hand over the screen to Dr. Richard.
Good morning to everyone, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to participate in this discussion with you guys. As and Dave has said, it's a pleasure to be able to do that. I've really focused this talk or this presentation on some fewer giraffe diseases, but maybe it's probably appropriate just to talk about some issues with regard to giraffe capture, specifically the southern giraffe that we have in the southern part of Africa, rather than the issues that you might be dealing with the Nubian or the Rothschild's giraffe. And let me just say that there are two ways in which giraffe are really caught in Southern Africa, and in Southern Africa in general, and we probably move a good couple of hundred, probably 600 to 800 giraffe a year. Most of these are by individual darting of the animals, and others are what we call mass capture. And I think you guys have already had some experience or some lectures with a lot of these, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. But when we talk about mass capture of giraffe, it's usually with the use of a helicopter that the giraffe are then pushed into a funnel-like arrangement of plastic chutes with cross curtains that get drawn behind the giraffe as they get pushed by helicopter down the chute and then get loaded up into the truck. And this is probably the safest way and the most common way of moving giraffe. There are many giraffe that have been moved from Namibia into South Africa over a distance of 400 or 500 kilometers, and fully adult animals are actually loaded like this, adult cows and probably adult males, or probably not black bulls over that distance, but certainly family groups of giraffe are moved over extensive distances. They probably would be subject to external parasite treatment of some sort, but I agree with what Victor has said, is that they are usually not tranquilized for this particular period. We find generally with certainly the southern giraffe that tranquilizers of whatever form are used make the giraffe a little bit unsteady on their feet, and sometimes they can actually go down from the effects of the drugs in the trucks, and therefore they're not routinely used. The other way of catching and handling giraffe is by individual darting, and there are many, many hundreds of giraffe that are darted annually in Southern Africa using opioids as the foundation for the immobilizing drug, and you guys know what those are. We'll talk a little bit and we'll mention them in the other two species that we're going to be talking about. But in general, opioids form the foundation drug for being able to immobilize these animals. These are often mixed with some sort of alpha-2 agonist or a butyrophenone of some sort. So you would have a mixture of thiofentanyl, etorphine as your opioid, or certainly given individually, and then mixed with midatomidine or azaparone to give you the desired effect. Now, different practitioners have got their own recipes or protocols that they like to use. Some people use high opioid doses in combination with azaparone and smaller doses of alpha-2 agonist like midatomidine. Other people use low doses of the opioid, but have higher combinations of midatomidine that they actually put into the dart. So you guys will know that giraffe have got a fairly thick skin. So essentially, any darting system can be used, any dart can be used, provided you've got a long enough needle that can penetrate the skin. And what is routinely done with chemical capture is that depending on the combination, that the giraffe, once the drug takes effect, will actually go down on its own, or depending on the combination that you used, the game capture team will get into place and will actually, with the use of ropes, get in front of the giraffe and actually trip it down until it goes down onto the ground. And when it's in that particular condition, you really have to be extremely well organized and committed to that capture. What is usually done is that a blindfold gets put around the eyes very soon after it's gone down. Earplugs are put into the ears, usually cotton wool or a bandage, rolled up bandage. A halter gets put around the actual head, and then lead ropes are attached to that halter. And once you've got the giraffe blindfolded and the halter is on, which has to happen very, very quickly, the full antidote is given to the giraffe, and the animal, blindfolded and roped, gets to its feet. And once you've got it in that particular position, you can actually lead it from there into a field recovery vehicle, still blindfolded, still with earplugs in the ear. If you take those off, you have got a problem. But if you've got the animal restrained or contained like that, you can walk it into a field recovery vehicle, you can load it, still blindfold it, and then take it up to a road transporter and transfer it from the field recovery vehicle into a truck. And once it's in the truck and the doors are closed in the truck, you can then take off the blindfold and the earplugs. Again, usually drugs are not given. If the animal place to place, the acaricides, etc., are given prior to that movement. But other than that, giraffes move very, very easily. They are wild giraffe. They are not handleable. They certainly will try and do you damage. So they get usually taken from one farm to another, and then they get offloaded into another farm wherever they are going to be taken to. So I haven't got a talk specifically on that, but I'm happy to answer any questions for you on that. But in terms of what we have to talk about, just to finish off or complement what Victor has been saying, I've got some information on giraffe conditions, and my thanks to colleagues, Pete Rogers and other people, for the use of their photographs. We've spoken about giraffe skin diseases, and the one on the left is a photograph that was taken in Wangi National Park here in Zimbabwe, where you had a complete overgrowth of probably papilloma-induced cancer-like lesions on the skin. And the question was asked in the chat earlier, what do you do to treat an animal like this? Well, these are not captive animals at all. This is in probably 200,000 hectares. And it only is an issue if you have many, many of these giraffes that get this infection. Will you make a decision about to do something with it? In some instances, some landowners will consider creating some sort of autogenous vaccine, knock the animal down, take off some of these papillomatous growths, grind them up, and actually make a vaccine. Or if there's very, very few of these animals that are sick in this particular way, just leave it. Or if the animal is completely overrun with these kind of lesions and unable to cope, then a decision must be made whether it's actually worth keeping that animal alive. The slide on the right-hand side is something that you guys are probably more familiar with. And then this is giraffe skin disease. And this photograph, I think, was taken in Arusha in Tanzania, and I believe is something that you get more commonly in East Africa. We don't see this kind of lesion in Southern Africa at all. And I'm not entirely sure of the etiology, but it's probably some sort of dermatophilus or some sort of fungal skin infection. You guys can correct me if I'm wrong. What other conditions do we see? You get unusual growths on the front of the skull, sometimes from injury. This is just a photograph that was taken off the internet, which is an incidental. Sometimes in captivity, we see almost like a syncobo disease or dermatophilus infection of the legs, in which there are weeping, crusty-like lesions on the bottom of legs, particularly if the giraffes are have been held in captivity, and probably to some extent the conditions that they've been in, and the conditions are fairly moist. That has happened. It's difficult to know what to do to treat them, because in these particular situations, even if giraffe are in captivity, to be able to treat their legs, you need to either knock them out, or you need to be able to put them into a crush, or to get close to them with some sort of sprayer that you can wet them with. And they are big, aggressive animals, and it's not always easy to do, even in captivity. Fractures are certainly something that is seen. This particular giraffe, you can see, has got a swollen carpus, and x-rays that that were taken of this particular joint, you can actually see that there are fractures that have happened with excessive bone growth on the sides of that to try and try and heal that wound, and you end up with a leg that looks like that is not completely usable, and then becomes a decision with the owner what they're going to be doing with that animal. If it's able to cope and it's doing fine, we'll just leave it. It will recover over the next couple of years. And that's often the case, and a decision that has to be made if you're dealing with completely wild animals. If you're dealing with animals that have high value in a semi-captive environment, like at the sanctuary, then your decision-making processes are different. But if you're dealing with completely wild animals, you often have to take a view that if these animals are wild, they either have to cope on their own, or you have to destroy them or put them down if it is going to be an issue for your particular management philosophy and how you want to deal with them. So various other things that are seen, you can see on the left-hand side, this is a post-mortem examination of a very, very swollen joint, probably induced by a snare. The wound around the snare has been cut open now, and you can see all the pus formation and things that happen in it. On the right-hand side, you can see what looks like, if you didn't know any different, you would say, well, that looks like foot and mouth disease in a giraffe, which they certainly can get, but not very commonly. But this is often the result of animals being in captivity or being caught, that they smash their muzzles and smash their heads up against the sides of an enclosure or a truck, and then they end up with these lesions in the mouth that's often secondarily infected. It bleeds, and one will just be aware that this is a wound from captivity or handling, rather than being an actual clinical infectious disease like foot and mouth disease. Okay, what other things can we see? We've spoken about anthrax. This is a slide taken in the Kruger National Park, where this giraffe has died, and you can see typically that they, as with many anthrax carcasses, they tend to throw their head back in almost an unusual condition. They show typical symptoms of anthrax, which you guys are aware of, and you know what they look like. The question is always, what do you do with anthrax if you have an outbreak? And it has happened many times in Southern Africa. The most appropriate response in the face of an anthrax outbreak in whatever species is to look at vaccination first. And you guys have been told that already in lectures, to see what vaccination needs to be used. Generally speaking, the anthrax is not limited to one particular species. So you have to spend a lot of time and money getting up in a helicopter and actually darting animals with an anthrax vaccine from the air, with a marking dart of some sort, and then mount a significant response using a vaccine to try and limit the extent of the disease. If you, obviously, you guys will remember that anthrax has got many cycles in terms of a blowfly cycle, in terms of the vectors and things that move it around. You have scavengers that can move anthrax around. And in fact, if you can also vaccinate, you can also treat animals that are in the early stage or about to become infected before the vaccine takes effect, that penicillin is a very efficient antibiotic to use to actually control or do something about anthrax. Okay, the other thing that is associated particularly with herbivores, and particularly things like giraffe, some publications have come out many years ago, which to some extent has been hotly debated, is that giraffe can get tannic acid poisoning. If you have got too many giraffe in a particular area, they start browsing on trees, and underground rooting systems from one tree to another will communicate that there is some sort of predation happening on a particular tree, and the trees in the area will start secreting higher levels of tannic acid. And then the idea is that the theory is that the giraffe will start eating some of these trees. It will be unpalatable, and they can actually consume browse if they do eat it with higher levels of tannic acid, and they can in fact die of tannic acid poisoning. Hotly debated, as I said, but it is a possibility that has been described here in Southern Africa in general. In captivity, what we sometimes do see, particularly for animals that are held in game auction scenarios in Southern Africa or held in quarantine prior for export going overseas, are things like rumen problems, from things like rumen acidosis, rumenitis. And here one needs to remember that it's simply not just a question of them being browsers. Giraffe will take leaves, sure, but they also will eat the terminal branchlets of that particular leaf, because they actually need roughage stimulation of that rumen. If they don't get enough roughage in, that rumen will start to atrophy, and you don't get adequate mixing movements, and then the giraffe end up with a complete water belly. They've overeaten on lucerne and cubes, and that's not really what they need. They need roughage in terms of twigs to be able to stimulate that rumen to keep it going and get adequate mixing movements to keep that giraffe okay. Sometimes with that associated with the rumen acidosis, sometimes get rumenitis that goes with it, which is a much, much more complicated scenario and more difficult to control, but it is a potential issue. The other thing with keeping giraffe in captivity, and particularly if they're fairly wild giraffe and you put them into enclosure, is that they're inclined to walk around, turn quite quickly, they get agitated. And the more agitated they are and the more they turn, the more you end up with a scenario in which you put pressure on their joints, or they put pressure on their joints, I should say. These joints start to swell, and then people think that there's actually something wrong with the giraffe. And in the animals that I have immobilized years ago, looking at some of these swollen legs, there's just really no particular issue in the joint capsule at all. You can clean out the joint capsule, take x-rays, and there really is nothing there other than probably just irritated cartilage, in which you have excessive synovial fluid that accumulates in that leg, carpus or joint, and there's nothing really specific that can be done about it. It's just really a question of management, and it talks to what sort of enclosure you've got, how wild your giraffe are to some extent, and how you're actually managing them in the bomas. So generally speaking, in Southern Africa, where we've got extensive ranches of 3,000 to 5,000 hectares in size, there might well be clinical infections that happen, particularly things of clostridial infections, various kinds. And this is really addressed by vaccination. Usually these animals are found when they are already dead, and on autopsy, a diagnosis is made of a particular clostridial infection. And then the only option to do really is to use multivalent vaccines, clostridial vaccines, of which there are a whole number here in South Africa that the vets will use. Animals are darted from a helicopter, and if this is a problem or a regular feature on a particular ranch, then this is often repeated on an annual basis. And the same goes for things like Pasteurella infections. Sometimes you get unusual situations like this particular giraffe that you can see has got this massive hole on the side of its neck. Now, it's always difficult to know what causes that. If it's from a fighting wound from another giraffe, or it's from a tusk from an elephant, difficult to know whether it's an old dart wound from some of the high impact darts that are used. That's difficult to see. And you will have to make a decision as the wildlife manager. Are you going to do anything about that? If it's naturally induced, and if it's a wild animal, do you let nature take its course? Or you as a wildlife manager are going to call in a veterinarian to dart and knock that animal out and treat that wound. It also depends on the general condition of that animal before you actually make a decision about what to do with that, to treat it with antibiotics, etc. Try and do something about whatever fly strike there might be on that wound, and if necessary, do any kind of a caricide treatment. The other thing that we see quite regularly in Southern Africa is what we call pica, which is just really an aberrant eating behavior, some sort of osteodystrophy, or rather osteophagia, in which the animals will often pick up bones or that are lying around, horns of impala. There was a very, very interesting case that was posted on one of the groups that we have here, in which a giraffe had eaten the skull of a duiker, and of a male duiker, and the horns had penetrated into the top of the pharynx, and the veterinarian managed to get the skull of the duiker out, treated the wounds as best he could, and then woke the animal up, treated it with antibiotics, and let it go. So it's usually, certainly in Southern Africa, probably the result of some sort of phosphate deficiency. Most of Southern Africa has issues with phosphate deficiency, and this happens and is seen in many species. So it's not uncommon for people to put out game block licks where needed, but very seldom do people actually put out feeding stations for giraffe on 5,000 hectares. It's just really not appropriate or necessary. But the downside of this is that because we know that Clostridium botulinum bacteria sometimes reside in these old pieces of bone, old carcasses, is that the giraffe can actually pick up botulism. And then if you do have animals that die and you essentially find you are unable to see any post-mortal changes, and you're unable to make a diagnosis, botulism is going to be one of your first DDs that you will consider, because essentially a botulism postmortem is a negative postmortem. And then you have to decide if this is a regular feature. Do I go and look at the option of vaccinating these giraffe? And again, some of the multivalent clostridial vaccines that we have available do contain Clostridium botulinum, or rather do treat for Clostridium botulinum infections. And I think that is probably largely me in terms of what I've got to say. I'm happy to answer any questions that you guys may have. So thank you very much as far as giraffe is concerned.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Richard. I can see we already have a few questions from the students. Yeah, so we will start with Noel. Noel is also a vet doctor.
I think I've been able to unmute.
Yes.
Noel Alinteireho, the head veterinarian, Danizu in Pakistan. I'm a new vet here. We've had experiences where the giraffes died from foreign bodies. Many giraffes died actually before I came here. And they say most of them had stones, mainly phytolith, and also a plastic mesh in the rumen. So I found here some other giraffes which are really not in good condition, and they suspect that these giraffes could have the same problem. So how can such cases be managed? I know ruminotomy is almost impossible. So what is your advice?
No, it's a problem with giraffes that pick up foreign objects. You're absolutely correct that a ruminotomy is going to be virtually impossible. If there are already some sort of phytoliths in the or stones actually in the rumen, it's virtually impossible to get them out unless you actually take them out physically. Those things can block up, particularly if it's rope, can block up parts of the intestine, and you could end up with all kinds of complications from interception to torsions, etc. It really is a question of management, that those giraffes should not have been exposed or given access to rope that they could have eaten it in the first place. If they're eating stones, why are they eating stones? That's not a normal situation in captivity. They must have other things that they get offered to them. And I wonder if they're not getting enough browse. If they're getting lucerne and pellets, that's fine. But if they don't get enough browse, they're going to be looking at other things to keep themselves occupied. And one of those is going to be picking up stones or ropes that are lying around. That should not happen. So I would look at, first of all, increasing the amount of browse available. But those giraffe that are looking poor, if it's due to some sort of phytolith or ingested issue, that's a major problem. But if they're in poor condition, start looking at feed as your fundamental issue and then work around that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Richard. Dr. Noah, are you happy? Yeah, I guess he is. All right, so we have also two questions from Master. Master, are you able to unmute and ask your questions?
Yeah, I have two questions. The first question was, how do you deal with the case of anthrax whenever you find like a Giraffe that has died in the national park or game reserve? And how do you deal with it, that condition? And the second question was like, if we have found that there are carnivorous animals that are eating a Giraffe that has died with anthrax, how do you deal with that case?
Okay, well, let's answer your first question. How do you deal with a carcass of an animal that has died from anthrax. The standard veterinary approach would be to say that you have to destroy that carcass either by burning it or by burying it. But if you've got 200 giraffe or 200 carcasses around you that have died of anthrax, and including elephant, as we'll see a little bit later, it's almost impossible to burn or bury that carcass. The amount of wood or trees that you'd have to chop down to burn that carcass adequately makes it an ecologically unsound proposition in terms of what to do. Certainly also, an individual anthrax carcass, you can have the spores from anthrax spread by flies. It can be spread by vultures from a particular carcass to other areas and to carry the infection to another reserve. And it is really a big problem if you have got anthrax in a reserve. And what is usually done is that if you make a diagnosis of anthrax, is to try and cover it up to some extent, try and keep the predators or scavengers away from it, and start vaccinating the animals around it. But that is in itself, the vaccination to some extent is the easy part. It requires time, it requires money to pay for helicopters, it requires money to get vaccination darts and vaccines, etc. available. But it's not an easy thing to control. But you have to be on the lookout for more cases that might develop in a particular area. If you've got carnivores that are eating on a anthrax carcass, as they will, birds are not really easily affected by anthrax. They will spread the spores to other species, but there are certainly cases in which lions, etc., have eaten on an anthrax carcass. They pick up anthrax themselves, and they typically show a swollen face or a swollen head, and they usually will die of anthrax as well. So that, unfortunately, is a problem. If you do see animals that are affected like that, the best option then is just to shoot them rather than to try and treat them or control them. Remember, the anthrax is a toxin that is largely secreted from the anthrax spores or the infection that occurs in the body, and to do and control an anthrax outbreak is very, very difficult. Some nature reserves here in Southern Africa will say, well, if an anthrax outbreak, it's part of nature. It's a naturally occurring soil bacterium that infects animal populations. And only if that carcass or those carcasses are close to areas where there are game drive vehicles or tourist routes, will they actually do something about trying to burn that carcass. Other big reserves where anthrax occurs endemically, for example, in Etosha National Park in northern Namibia, many years ago, and I don't know what the policy is now, but they considered anthrax to be an endemic and natural part of the ecosystem, and animals that had died of anthrax were simply just left and left to exposed to the elements. Those carcasses were scavenged. It depends on how hungry the lions are. If the carcass is opened and those bacterium sporulate, then they can infect scavengers and things that will eat them. But if you've got a small carcass like a springbuck that has died of anthrax, and you've got a pride of lions that gets on top of that springbuck, they will demolish that carcass probably in 2 minutes and will devour it before the anthrax bacterium have had time to sporulate, which is what they do on exposure to air, and spread the disease from there. So there are different disease philosophies that are used by parks, and it depends on what your objective is in a particular reserve or game ranch.
Thank you so much, Dr. Richard. And there is also another question from Joshua. Joshua is asking you to share the insights on cases of abortions in giraffe, i.e. common causes, remedies, and personal experience? How do you diagnose it?
Joshua, the incidence of abortion in giraffes is very, very rare. In most instances, as Victor explained earlier, the calving is a fairly, and let me rephrase that. In most instances, giraffe calve normally. And the calves that are born are fairly strong and healthy. The only problems that you might see is if your giraffe are in very, very poor condition and they've been kept in areas in which there's not enough nutrition, there's not enough browse, that you might have problems with that fetus actually being delivered to term, and you might have an abortion happening because of really inadequate nutrition, inadequate protein available to the animal. But that will be well before term, probably in the first or second trimester, rather than, but could it also happen in the third trimester? But that's largely due to nutrition. There are diseases, for example, like Brucella abortus, that might well affect giraffe. The incidence of that has not really been adequately documented within Southern Africa in general, and whether that disease actually plays a significant role, I really am not aware of. Things like Rift Valley fever, etc., can cause abortion storms in certain domestic animals, and certainly been described in buffalo, but it's not been, to my knowledge, been a regular feature of handling or taking care of giraffe in any kind of semi-intensive or wild situation.
Thank you so much. And we have one more question before we take a break. From Chikondi. Chikondi is saying, in case of translocating to distant places like another country, which is maybe 24 hours beyond, how are they prevented from moving around since they are awake and active?
Okay. Chikondi, all right. The big difference in terms of what Victor was saying in terms of how I think you are moving giraffe from the sanctuary to what happens with the hundreds of giraffe that we move around Southern Africa is that these giraffe are in completely enclosed trucks. So you'd have in a giraffe transporter, you'll have maybe 2 compartments that can take 3 or 4 giraffe each, and those giraffes are awake and completely standing. They cannot, they can see out through the slits on the side of the trailer, but the roof of the compartment is closed. So there is no way that the giraffe can actually have their head up above the top of the container. Generally speaking, they travel extremely well like that. There might be an occasional youngster or young animal, 18-month old animal, 2-year-old animal that is maybe slightly younger than the other adults. They may lie down in that container while that compartment while the truck is moving, and it's fine. The other giraffe step around it. They very rarely tread on it. Sure, if the road is very, very bumpy and uneven, the giraffe will bounce around a bit, but if they are steady on their feet and they haven't had excessive doses of tranquilizers, they travel extremely well.
Thank you so much. I can see there is another.
Shall I answer that last question before we break?
Yes, you can.
Okay, so the question is on worm infestation. Most wild animals have got worms that are unique to their own species. So unless they are kept in conditions of confinement in captivity, where you mix or have animals in a small pen, so you will often have worms that are unique to sable, being unique to sable. You'll have worms that are unique to giraffe, and they very seldom infect each other unless they are badly managed. So worms are generally not a big problem as far as giraffe are concerned. Remember that they are browsers. They tend to eat at fairly high levels above the ground, and most life cycles of the worms eggs are excreted onto the ground. The animals get infected from eating grass on the ground or anything that's lying on the ground, and certainly they can do that, I suppose, if they're picking up bones or carcasses. But worms are, generally speaking, very seldom an issue with wild populations of giraffe. And there's never any standard protocol or strict approach to deworming of most wild animals prior to translocation, if it's from wild to wild scenarios. And the same thing applies to giraffe. Okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you.